Minneapolis has 7 new city council members who will be sworn in early next year. This is a diverse group, both in ideology and demographics. WCCO's Esme Murphy sat down with the newly elected members and discussed some of the biggest issues facing the city. Issues like public safety and revitalizing downtown. Let's take a look.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. We're sitting here with the 7 new council members-elect for the city of Minneapolis. I do want to say in Ward 2, Robin Wansley-Warlebaugh is here. She is the certified winner of Ward 2. However, her opponent that finished 19 votes behind her has asked for a recount. So there is a city-sanctioned recount in Ward 2. So I just wanted to let everybody know that and let our audience know that. I guess I want to get into it right away. Let's talk political differences first. Who supported Charter Amendment 2? If you can raise your hands. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. And who voted against Charter Amendment 2? So that is, all right. So that's 4, right?
4 supported it.
4 supported it, and 3 voted against it. All right. So I did that to start with because I want to recognize that obviously there are political differences here, and that's important. But what I'd like to know is, in terms of public safety, we know that the mayor is in charge. We know that the mayor is strengthened here under the Charter Amendment 1, which passed. What I'd like to know is, can each of you pledge here today that you will work with each other and other council members to try and get a handle on the public safety crisis that is hurting so many people in our community? And I guess we'll start with Ward 1 and you, sir.
Yeah, we have to. This is life and death. And so despite the outcome of the election, I think everyone here sincerely ran because they saw the crisis that we were operating under. And I think we all know that we need to change our system of policing. And so now the question is how, but I don't think the question of what has changed as a result of this election.
How about you?
Absolutely. You know, regardless of the outcome of, question 2, more than 50,000 residents supported a new pathway forward of how we're addressing public safety. And I agree with Elliot, that mandate is still there. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to figure out what are ways in which we can leverage pressure or work in tangent with, Mayor Fry to make sure that we provide a standardized quality public safety service to every single resident in Minneapolis, regardless of their race, income, or background. Everyone deserves that.
And I think all of you sitting here are an indication that the voters wanted to change. So, Michael Rainville?
Well, Esme, you're absolutely right. It's not only Charter Amendment 2, and I do pledge to work with the council members, the new and the current. We have to figure this out. We have to get the city moving forward and heal and go forward. But also, we have to recognize that Charter Amendment 1, the voters basically took a little bit of power away from the city council because it was dysfunctional and it wasn't working with the mayor. So that's another issue that has to be recognized. It's very important for all of us to get along with the mayor under the new system.
All right, Ms. Vita?
Thank you. I want nothing more than to work with my colleagues on the council, the people of our city. This issue around public safety was the one thing that was dividing us, and it should have been what was bringing us together. When I knocked those doors in Ward 4, people were scared, people were worried about what question 2 really meant. So I'm looking forward to working with my colleagues on the council. I'm looking forward to having a table where everyone feels like they can be heard if they want a seat. And it's the one thing that's going to bring us together. It divided us. It's going to bring us back together stronger and better than ever, and we'll have a safe and just system.
Okay. And Mr. Chavez, I know you're one of the 3 Democratic Socialists who won here. What do you think? I mean, can you work with all these other people who don't share your views?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's what the 9th Ward deserves. We have had 2 hard years here from police violence and both community violence that has impacted the people of my ward. I was on a call with Councilmember-elect Vita, and we both talked about addressing the gun violence that's impacting both the South Side and the 9th Ward, and Ward 4 and 5 that's killing a lot of our neighbors. And that's what the 9th Ward deserves. That's what Minneapolis deserves. We need to address both, like I mentioned earlier, the police violence that's killing my neighbors and the gun violence that's impacting my ward. So that's my commitment to the 9th Ward, and that's what I plan to do.
All right, Ms. Choctaw?
Yeah. You know, I want to just echo what everyone else is saying. Absolutely. I'm 100% committed to working not just with the group of people over here. You know, you pointed this out on our phone call that the majority of the city council is made up of new members. That's both, you know, that's something to be really excited about, bringing in new energy, new perspectives into this decision-making space. And then, you know, working with the mayor too, in addressing our city's public safety concerns, right? You said it at the beginning, the police is solely accountable to the mayor, and, you know, helping him step up to that challenge, that's our role. That is the role of Minneapolis residents everywhere too, and making sure that every person in our city has the safety that they deserve. And so, you know, really looking forward to working with this group in helping the mayor achieve that, in, you know, working towards achieving all of the different things that we know contribute to public safety, like every resident in Minneapolis having access to safe, dignified, and affordable housing, and all of the services that we need to live full lives.
All right. Ms. Koski?
Yes, I mean, again, echoing, and this is our first time all together, and it's exciting to be together, and I am beyond excited to collaborate and connect with each of you, and then also, like you said, our mayor too. And it's beyond important because every single voter, every single community member here in Minneapolis is depending on us. They're depending on us to connect and to find common goals and work together. And, you know, public safety was the #1 issue throughout every single ward in the city. And it's something I know that each one of us are going to come to the table with different ideas and thoughts and connect with the mayor and want to move forward and want to move forward quickly because we don't have time to lose.
All right.
So.
I know that the numbers are so horrifying. 84 deaths, 50 attempted carjackings or carjackings in 1 week, 54 children shot in Minneapolis, 54 children. Some of them have died. I know that this is all of desperate concern to all of you, but do you have any specifics? You will, as council members, still have the purse strings, and that's a big power. What would you like to see? Any specifics out there that you'd like to see? Any of you? Sure.
Yeah, one thing that was really instrumental to our campaign is addressing this gun violence. One thing that hasn't happened is in our budget, there isn't a reflection of how serious gun violence is happening in our neighborhoods. When we were talking on the phone, the reason I brought it up a lot is because Ward 4, 5, 6, and 9 have a lot of people being killed from gun violence, and our budget isn't reflecting that. So I know we don't really have much say on what our budget's gonna look like, but I'm gonna be working with people to bring up these concerns in our upcoming budget, but also for the following year and calling for a gun violence public health crisis to address what's happening with programs in place to make sure that we can have less guns on the streets and programs in place for our youth to address the underlying conditions like youth employment, housing, mental health, and all the issues that need support for our community members here.
And you bring up a really good point. Not every ward is affected equally here. There are some people who've borne the brunt of this. Would you like to see more of those dollars targeted to the wards where clearly there has been more of a problem?
Yeah, it's an equity issue. There's specific wards that are being killed, and it's because of lack of resources and the decades long that I've talked about of underinvestment in these wards. Youth do not have access to jobs because our budget doesn't reflect that. There isn't programs in place to get these guns off the streets or address this gun violence problem because our budget doesn't reflect that, and it should.
How about more police officers?
That has come up many times in Ward 4. There's a lack of police presence. What I've heard from folks is that we want good police officers, but we want to have a police presence in our ward. I brand on that we need people from our communities. We need a robust recruitment program for officers. Ward 4 is just, I mean, it's different. Jason and I had a great conversation just about how different wards are. You know, some people don't see what we see. Myself, like at my campaign office, I heard a shooting happen in a barbershop, a neighborhood barbershop right behind me. Like multiple gunshots just going off in the middle of the day. That has become commonplace in Ward 4, where during the day there's gun violence, there's traffic incidents, and the people of Ward 4 feel we need more police presence in our ward. So yes, that is a part of the plan for our ward.
Anybody else on specifics? Ms.
I think there's something that was raised between Jason and Latricia's point is it's not a either or. I think the way in which we tackle gun violence, and we know most of it is concentrated, and this is as someone who's come from Southside Chicago that also has been plagued by that. We've seen through 20 plus years of data, heightened increase, investments in policing also doesn't correlate with decrease in gun violence. What we do see actually, bring those levels down is when we start to stabilize those communities. And I'm really glad that you brought up, both Aisha and Jason, the fact of housing, the fact that one of the most successful measures or ballot measures that passed was rent control. We have an avenue to pass a strong 3% rent control policy to make sure that families are not housing insecure. I'm glad that you raised the fact that it's not only about budgetary investments, but are we making sure?
And we are getting to rent control here a little bit, because that is important. Michael Rainville, I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so what I'd like to see with policing is immediately stopping the gun violence, and I'm anxious to learn how that can happen from the experts, because it's impacting all of us, and in Ward 3 it impacts downtown. I was downtown earlier today meeting someone, and to walk the streets and they're empty, it's just not a good thing. We need to get the revenues back going. If we're going to invest in our community, which we all want to do, those dollars have to come from the private sector in the form of taxes and fees. So we have to be mindful of regenerating downtown. But if I just quickly, Esme, I really want to see, as we rebuild our police force, recruiting from our own youth, our own young women and young men. We have to find a way to have people understand how honorable it is to serve the public as a police officer.
Well, that is a great point. Ms. Chota,
well, and while we're talking about public safety, I think something that feels really, really important to bring up in this moment, right, is we know that crime, it is not a product of someone's morality. It's not an indicator of someone's morality. It's truly a product of scarcity. And right now, our communities, specifically talking about this as an equity issue, our communities that are made up majority of people of color, of renters, of working class people, have experienced scarcity like we have not before, right? And
so you're saying
moments
that the
like
economic factors are to blame.
Economic factors
I don't think everybody would
absolutely
agree with you on that, but I take your point, and certainly you're entitled to your opinion on that. You folks here, Ms. Vita and Mr. Rainville, have raised some interesting questions. How do we get good people, good men and women, young people, to become police officers? The latest statistics I've seen, the percentage of police officers that live in the city of Minneapolis, single digits, and certainly the percentage of people of color, very low. What about incentivizing it? How about giving a young police officer a break on their taxes? I mean, what do you think about something like that?
I think incentivizing is definitely one way that we can get people from our community, put people of color who have low home ownership rates to begin with. Incentivizing on home ownership is one way. Incentivizing on, I've talked about this during my campaign. At the state level, there are people who made mistakes 20, 25 years ago with maybe parking tickets or something like that, and they can't be a police officer, driving after suspension, things like that would stop them. They live in our communities. They're our next door neighbors. Like, how do we incentivize criminal records at the state level so that people have an opportunity to apply for these jobs? How do we reach out to middle school kids and begin those relationships? I work with kids every day, have for 15 years at North Point, and sometimes high school is too late. They've already got involved in things. So how do we start with like the PALS programs and some of the police programs that we have in place, and not just police, but fire, like all of those jobs that creates that you get to be of service in your community. How do we start them on the Pathways program that we have in place already? Like, how do we get folks interested in those things through incentives and through education? I believe is going to be key.
Okay. And Ms. Chota, I know you have talked about different forms of, quote, policing. You'd like to see different people respond, as many of you would, to certain situations. Do you see a separate corps that would be part of the police department that wouldn't actually be armed, but they would be responding to a whole host of issues, including mental health issues?
Absolutely. I know this is something Elliot's worked on in the past. I work in the labor movement. I work for SEIU, Minnesota State Council. One of the things that our members, who we represent security officers who work downtown, and one of the things that our members have worked on over the last couple of years is creating a program that really sees, right, because our members do every single day. They are the frontline response. They are the ones that have to intervene in escalating situations before police officers arrive. They understand deeply, both by having that experience in their workplace and by being Minneapolis residents and by being Black and brown largely, that that we need a different form of frontline response, and have helped create, rolled up their sleeves and helped create this program that really looks at, responding to 911 calls, that really looks at crime intervention in a more people-centered and public health-centered way, which is what 66,000, something like that, right? Minneapolis residents told us at the ballot as well, and so working on figuring out, working on,
they want to keep their police department. They
to answer your question though, working on figuring out how we are making sure that we are responding to different situations that come up in our communities with more specialized response that actually serves residents, that gets people their immediate short-term need met, and sets us up to have a better response system altogether, is a good thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to add that too, because we're both labor organizers that work for the statewide teachers union, and we recognize the current makeup of policing is inherently unsustainable right now. We're talking about walking into a deficit next year because of the PTSD claims, because of the settlements paid out to families like George Floyd and other survivors of police violence. People do not want to go and work for an institution that is inherently distrusted by the public also right now. And largely why? Because we ask these frontline responders to be mental health providers, to be domestic violence interrupters, to be family counselors, to be several roles into one. How about we actually use this opportunity to pay people who went to school, gather that expertise, to be part of our public safety system, so that in the incidents of heightened crimes and violence, we have that armed response for that. But data shows, you worked on that a large percentage of 911 calls doesn't warrant our armed response. Right. So we can invest in that.
And I hear what you're saying, an alternative response for alternative situations. But again, 84 homicides this year, 50 carjackings in 1 week, or attempted carjackings, 54 children killed. I mean, something has had to happen when it comes to these violent crimes that's unsustainable. I know many women, young women and old women, myself sometimes included, that don't like to stop at night for gas in Minneapolis. That's something that didn't used to happen.
So I ran because I was working in City Hall, helping launch the mental health response. Under the current system, the opposition to question 2, they were saying the current system allows these alternatives already. We don't need to change the charter to implement an alternative response to police. The reality is, in trying to implement that system, the current institution was slowing that work down or even stopping it through bureaucratic games, for lack of a better term. And so my hope with the Department of Public Safety was for us to be able to move forward with intent around these alternative responses. We still can do that, but we all have to be in alignment on what the reality of that challenge is. And I grew up in a neighborhood where I had a bullet go through my bedroom wall as a 6-year-old. So this is not like a hypothetical academic conversation for me. This is a real lived experience. And that's not an acceptable way to live, living under that type of hypervigilance. But the question is, who has the right mission to address the needs of our community? And right now, the police force has a mission that's way too broad in scope, and so they're stretched way too thin. And so one of the things that can help narrow the focus of that mission so that they can do the types of targeted interventions that would be effective against gun violence is to take some of the burden off of their plate so that we can focus on what police are good at and then have alternatives for those 15% of 911 calls that don't need an armed response. That's what our team discovered.
You bring up a very good point. You've seen it at City Hall. Efforts to reform the police department and to increase accountability have been thrown out the window a lot of times. And that has gone on for years, decades even. How about you, Emily Koski? What would you like to see that changes that? Because that is a very good point.
Yeah, I think to piggyback on both what Robin and Elliot have said is that we have to define what a police officer and what we want a police officer to do. And then we have to assess what the needs are of our city. And then we have to decide what are the other responses that need to happen and what are the other organizations that need to grow and where do we need to invest that. And so, but we can't recruit new good officers if we don't define what we want them to do. So we're never going to be able to do that if we don't do that work first. So I think for me, that's one of the first things that we need to do is make sure we define that.
Any other thoughts on public safety?
Well, I want to interject. I'm really curious why we turned our back on the county to help us with the social workers, the mental health responders, and hired a whole new company to help do that. There was a program in place, and instead of bringing in the county as a partner, we should also be reaching out, I feel, to state and even federal agencies to help us in Minneapolis. Minneapolis, for the last 4 years, has thought of itself as an island, that only we had the right ideas and we had the right answers. That hasn't worked. We need the county, especially on the mental health responders, the social workers. And so I'm very anxious to understand why we're not a stronger partner with Hennepin County.
All right, interesting point. And yes.
Oh, go ahead, Jason.
You sure?
Go ahead.
I mean, when we talk about recruitment, I think it's also talking about the elephant in the room. The Minneapolis Police Department came into my ward, slashed people's tires. They came in, arrested. And
during the riots?
During the uprising. And they came in and hurt and arrested small business owners who were protecting their own small business from people that were trying to harm them. A lot of the times, when we talk about recruitment, it's difficult to do that when there's a toxic culture within a department that continues to enact pain and trauma into the people of my ward and people of Minneapolis. It's difficult to do that when there's no accountability. They came into the 9th Ward and caused a lot of pain, and that needs to be talked about because it's difficult to train an officer to do the right thing when a department is already inherently causing a lot of trauma into a community, especially the 9th Ward. And that's what I got elected because I was talking about the toxic culture within the police department that needs to be addressed, and that's one thing I'm going to continue talking about.
And there is a video out there that shows these people hunting protesters. One of the people that is in that video was the head of training for the Minneapolis Police Department. He testified at the Derek Chauvin trial. And that is shocking. That really is a source of tremendous concern.
It wasn't shocking to me.
Yeah.
It wasn't shocking to you.
Well,
okay.
and this is the thing, right? Like, you described that experience as something that's shocking. The residents of Minneapolis, in many of our communities will tell you that that was not shocking behavior at all. That was something that they're very much so used to, and they're gaslit out of believing being true, right? And so when we talk about wanting to change our culture within the Minneapolis Police Department, again, the responsibility of the mayor, but when we talk about making these types of structural changes, when we talk about, recruiting better officers, when we talk about, reforming this institution, the reality is, like, we thought 5 years ago that body cams were going to be this revolutionary change that was going to make the Minneapolis Police Department
better. It has
better.
made a change.
And
they are
just
a dramatic tool.
To your point, right? Like we saw on video with body cam footage, the officer in charge of training police officers, new officers, on camera talking about, violating the rights of the press, of hunting protesters, right? Like, this was not, so like this is the thing I want to come back to, right? Is
well, I think if you got some officers that perhaps, for them to know they were on camera and to say that, tells me one thing.
There's a history of not having accountability.
Not having accountability, and also, frankly, not very smart. Really, it's not very smart at all.
But I wanted to just say that, in Ward 4, we've had multiple children be shot in the head and pass away over this last year on the north side as a whole. And so we don't believe that the answer to this violence is just policing, but we want to make sure that this plan moving forward is well thought out. Some people have said you want to, like, I'm for alternative emergency responses, but we have to make sure that it's well thought out. I went on a series of ride-alongs throughout the city, and the last call I went to was some kids called in and said they were locked in a closet. That is something that would have been seen as a social worker call, right? It doesn't sound violent, it's nothing. It's just some kids called and said, we're locked in the closet, we can't get out. When I got there with the police officer who I was in the car with, the other police officer called him on the radio and said, don't let her out. I just panned the window and there's an AK-47. So until we start having conversations about gun violence and guns as a whole, the right, like my neighbor has a gun, like the right to carry guns in our community, we have to really think about like how we move forward with this plan with social workers and alternative emergency responses. And then also too, in my experience, a lot of the social workers I had, even as a child, when my mom had an open child protection case, it was a white woman from the suburbs who hadn't had experiences with people who looked like me, who came in our house and saw what was just a regular Sunday football dinner that my mom hosted every year because she was the cool, every Sunday because she was the cool aunt, as a drug house. So like we have to be mindful of just the cultural differences, and when we're asking people to come into our communities, like, are they aware that Black people like to have fun on Sundays and have dinner and have a football
white
party?
people do too.
Or I'm just speaking for me, I'm Black. Yeah. And that's what happened in my house, and what was seen as a child protection issue, and I was taken out of my household from my mother because of that. And it was the social worker who just came in for a wellness check because a neighbor said we had a drug house.
You're absolutely right. Can I add to that?
Well, I want to move on here because we have a lot of topics to cover, and there's a big one, rent control, rent, housing. You told me that this was the #1 issue in the Uptown ward that you're going to represent in the city council. Tell us about what you heard. And 80% of the people who live in your ward are renters.
Absolutely. You know, so Ward 10 is made up of the Whittier, Wedge, Uptown, East Harriet, and East Bay-McCoska neighborhoods, all the way over to the lake and down to 42nd. And that, you know, so it is, you know, it's like a very interesting shaped ward, but 80% of residents in Ward 10 are renters. 70% of residents who in Echo are renters. And we live in a majority renter city, and you know, of all of the debriefs on the election, right, so much of it focuses on the failure of question 2 or the passage of question 1, but the reality is overwhelmingly question 3 passed in all of our wards, right? I'd love to actually see hands on who here supported question 3.
Well, who here supported question 3?
Yep. And the way that, you know, the residents in our community supported this question, right? So we have a mandate from the electorate of Minneapolis right now that we need rent control in this city to alleviate the experiences that renters in this city have, right? To check the monopoly that corporate developers have on the housing market in this city, that we need to pass strong rent control, a clean rent control for Minneapolis residents, right? A 3% cap that we know
I have to cut you off here, but what about the situation in St. Paul? You've got a really interesting situation in St. Paul where they did vote for a very specific cap, a 3% cap on rents. And immediately, the largest project that was being built in St. Paul, they've paused it. It's this huge project that would be the entire, I want to let some other folks talk.
That's not what we voted on here either.
But I know it's not, but how do you balance, my question is, how do you balance?
Well, I mean, like that policy in particular, like our rent control ballot, our rent stabilization ballot question was about staff exploring different ideas moving forward.
Right.
So this idea of like, we need a 3% cap, or those things aren't like, just like a certain rent control policy is not what
correct.
What we had here. What I plan to do moving forward is to work with my colleagues and work with the residents of Ward 4 to figure out what we need best, because it did pass, but everyone in Ward 4 didn't see this, you know, the 3% cap. We talk more about slumlords. We talk more about having availability for more housing in Ward 4. A lot of the people in my ward, they get Section 8 or some type of subsidized housing. And so the 3% cap wouldn't affect them as much as, you know, having an actual place to live.
Well, let's talk about that. A two-bedroom apartment in Minneapolis, the average, and some of you are shaking your heads and you probably know, nearly $2,500 a month. Emily Koski, your thoughts about trying to figure out a way to change that?
Well, I think, you know, back to question 3 and how we support this, and over half of Minneapolis are renters, and so we have to be focusing on renters' rights, and we have to be bringing in a lot of voices to that conversation, and that's the piece I have not seen. And that means property owners, that means developers. So it's not, we didn't vote on 100% that we're gonna have a 3% cap. That was St. Paul. We voted to allow us to start to really dig in, work together, and make sure that we're making the right decisions for all of the residents here in Minneapolis. And there needs to be more people at the table for that conversation, and property owners are part of that. We need to learn and we need to lean on our experts. And so it's not as cut and dry as yes or no. It is now our responsibility to do the hard work to decide what is going to be the best for the residents of Minneapolis.
And Council Member, I'd like to hear from Elliot Payne because we haven't heard
I
from
think
him.
we need to make a distinction between property owners and renters, because property owners represent a wide swath of different interests. And when we talk about St. Paul and a certain developer pulling out of St. Paul because of rent control, that's a unilateral game of chicken between corporate America and our capacity to regulate our society. So I am not particularly interested in the interests of industry that has more lobbying power than any other interest in the country. I think the National Real Estate Association is a larger lobbying group than the NRA. And we make a big boogeyman out of the NRA, but the National Real Estate Association has way more power than the NRA when it comes to shaping regulation in our country. So I don't have a lot of patience for those interests. I think we do need to listen to single-family landlords that live in one unit and then rent out their other unit in a duplex. That's a very different entity than a Wall Street funded corporation that buys up all the single family homes in a neighborhood, and then such as Havenbrook, and then starts jacking the rents up year over year because it's a cash cow. We need to make a very meaningful distinction between those two interests and the impact in those two different parts of the industry as we think through how we approach this policy.
I want to shift now to businesses and bringing businesses back. And I'd like to start with Councilmember-elect Chavez. In your ward, there are estimates that as many as 1,500 small businesses were destroyed, and there are some estimates that only 21% have made it back. What kinds of incentives would you like to see to bring these businesses back, to give them a start again? Because obviously they've dealt with something that's so difficult, and on top of that, the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, so one thing I've made very clear from day one is that my priorities are the small businesses, not the corporations that are trying to gentrify my ward, especially on Lake Street. So we need to bring back the small businesses, the mom and pop shops that are struggling, that were burned to the ground, and that are still struggling to even pay
what would you like to do for them?
Yeah, so one thing that a lot of the small businesses need is community ownership of their buildings. That is really important to make sure that they can own their land in their own property, in their own corridor. There's a lot of landlords who I do not represent in the 9th Ward in the Lake Street corridor who abuse their tenants, who are making them pay extra money just to rent out the current building that they're in, that are threatening them of moving them to a different place because they don't want them to be in that building. I know someone that's $7,000 in debt, and that the owner of the building is trying to kick her out.
So you're talking about rent control issues for small businesses to protect them.
Yeah. Commercial, yeah.
What are your thoughts, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I think it even goes, even another step before this. And as a small business owner myself, that there's a lot of barriers and in Minneapolis in order to have and establish and start your business. So we want to create and make more, and we especially want to support our BIPOC communities. And we have to make sure that we're looking at what some of those barriers are for them. And there's a lot of barriers, and there's a lot of, I had a business owner that came to me in the 11th ward, and he wanted to have a business actually in the 1st ward, but he lives in the 11th ward. I mean, this is where, as colleagues, we can work together to make sure that we can support them. But I think we need to have a better small business liaison within the city, within our city coordinator's office, to make sure that they're helping, supporting. When you're a business owner, you're an expert at owning a restaurant or being a baker. You don't understand the ins and outs and all the contracts and the zoning and all the different issues that come up when you're trying to just support your family and support your community. And so we need to have more connections with our small business owners.
One thing I've heard about, if I can, in terms of small businesses over and over again for years is the amount of regulations and hoops you have to jump through to get a business started in this city is significantly more than you would if you were in, let's say, Bloomington, any place else, St. Louis Park, and the taxes are higher. Your thoughts, Michael Rainville, on that?
Well, Esme, everybody is right about having home ownership, business ownership. What an opportunity on Lake Street to rebuild that in a way. We have to learn the lessons from the last civil unrest we had in the 60s. If you go down Plymouth Avenue now, that was a vibrant business district, and it no longer is. There's still empty land from the late 60s. So we have to think, how do we revitalize not only Lake Street, West Broadway, but downtown as well, keep that strong. And you're right, it's very confusing if you're a small business. You might know how to bake, or you might know how to run a restaurant, but you don't know how to get through the maze in City Hall. So we have to make that easier, and that's going to take that one-on-one staffing to actually bring somebody into the business world and into compliance.
Let's talk about downtown Minneapolis and Nicollet Mall. If any of you have been on there recently, it's not what it used to be. There used to be a lot of small businesses, big corporations. It can at times be a scary place. What has to be done to improve downtown? Is there a future for downtown in a new world where businesses are going to be cutting back and many more of us are going to be working from home?
We have to wrap our arms around public safety. I mean,
that's the key.
I believe that's a place for us to start for downtown. We have to work together and come up with a strong plan and a way that we're going to move together and move forward together on this. And I think that will help, downtown. The other piece is we have to be connecting with our chamber. We have to be connecting with these businesses, and we have to want to support it. It's the engine. Downtown is the engine that supports the rest of our city, and we have to want to make sure that we're continuing to invest there. I mean, the Dayton's project just went up. We have to get excited and take those traditions back and go back downtown and bring your kids and connect. And we have to start doing that.
This is your ward, so let me go to you here.
Yes, so we all have to realize as we learn how the city works and functions, and in fact, Robin, I'm sorry I have my back to you, but we're going to go to city council school in 2 weeks from today and learn how it works. So the Casey, the city clerk, has got a great education lined up. Part of that education, and I can say this because I worked for 35 years for the Minneapolis Convention and Visitors Association. The economic engine that is downtown, when it is working, that's what funds the neighborhood projects. When it's not working, all of our taxes.
In terms of the tax base?
Yes, the taxes and the fees. We have to have a vital downtown so we can have vital neighborhoods. And we're going to have to balance that and come to grips with that. Emily, I agree with you that public safety is key. You have to make people feel comfortable. When I was door knocking, people just don't go downtown. They go out to the suburbs to eat and entertain themselves now. That has to be reversed.
People don't feel safe in Minneapolis.
We need to acknowledge that we're living in an active pandemic. Minnesota's spiking right now. And so when we're talking about congregating downtown, I mean, what makes downtown a powerful economic engine is the density. And density means bringing bodies close together. The problem with Nicollet is you don't have lunch crowds anymore. I mean, a vibrant downtown has a vibrant...
Will we ever get lunch crowds back?
We don't know that, and so I think it's really important for us to ask cause and effect. And this once-in-a-generation black swan event of COVID-19 is, I think, the bigger question. And how are we going to talk about revitalizing downtown without talking about vaccine rates, So I think public safety is important, but when I talk about public safety, and this was important during the campaign, public safety is not police. Public safety is safety. And part of that is having a vaccinated population. Part of that is having safe COVID protocols. And I think people aren't going downtown because they're not comfortable congregating in person yet.
Well, I think people, as somebody who works downtown, as somebody who has a child at the University of Minnesota, people don't feel safe downtown. People don't feel safe at the University of Minnesota. That's your district.
No, it's actually Robin.
Oh, sorry, Robin, excuse me.
Yeah, and actually to clarify, one of the key pieces we're missing out of this conversation about business is also supporting the workers. Are the businesses in downtown paying minimum wages, or let alone are they actually enacting it? Because we know, as someone who worked on a 15 minimum wage campaign, there's a lot of businesses downtown that have failed to enact that for the workers. Are we making sure people are getting PPE equipment so that they can come into a safe environment? So you can't have a strong economic engine without workers, and we also saw that within this pandemic. And that's the same with rebuilding Like my ward also faced massive destruction in the wake of the uprising. And many of the businesses have failed to come back, especially those that were Black and brown and indigenous owned, because one, the city has not provided capital improvements, and those capital improvements can make sure that workers are being paid what they deserve, make sure that they get the benefits that they need. We're seeing a huge exodus of workers from most jobs right now because we've taken them for granted. So prioritize workers and actually rebuilding what you think is downtown, not trying to give more or deregulate big business. That has never worked in the history, especially for working class people.
All right. I want to shift now to another topic, and a number of you said this was a top priority, climate change, that the city of Minneapolis has got to do a better job when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, our climate action plan hasn't been updated in over 5 years. And we also have this opportunity in our partnership with the utilities around our franchise fees, around putting more solid commitments to renewable energy generation. Right now, there's a soft agreement between the city and our energy utilities to invest in renewable energy, but it's a soft agreement. We need to make those codified in those franchise fees. The fees the city charges our power companies to have right of way for the power lines. There's a huge opportunity there, and I think that our clean energy partnership between the utilities needs to be a stronger point of leverage when it comes to shifting to hitting our goals.
Ms. Chaktai, I see you nodding over here. I know that climate change is a huge concern in your district that represents the Whittier and also Uptown. What are your thoughts about climate change and the city's priorities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in the fight for the survival of our planet, right, I said this to you the other day, I'm the youngest person elected to the Minneapolis City Council. When I serve, I will be the youngest person to ever serve on the Minneapolis City Council, and that's not an accident, right? We elected 3 of our youngest people to the council this year, and it's because Minneapolis residents really do see the urgency of the fight for the survival of our planet as the front and center issue in this moment, and they see that there are certain people who are really going to fight for it, and those are the people who are going to have to live with the fact that our air is not breathable, and not those who have benefited off of it in the past. And so, absolutely, working to make sure that we are prioritizing, renewable energy within our partnership with Excel and the monopoly that they have on energy in our city. But beyond that, right, we know that Black people and Indigenous people have been on the front lines of the fight for the survival of our planet for a long time, and
they
it is in large part,
and they sometimes are on the short end of the stick when it comes to policies that help.
Exactly, right, yes. And that was going to be, that's exactly it, and the reason for that is because Black, brown, and Indigenous people largely experience the frontline impact of environmental catastrophe. And so, lifting up the leadership of our folks on the front line who are saying, it's time for us to shut down industrial polluters in the city of Minneapolis, and make sure that Northern Metal can no longer operate in this city, making sure that we are working on shutting down the HERC that largely is responsible for giving asthma to Black and brown children in this city. And so, making sure that we are prioritizing the people who are most severely impacted and lifting up the leadership of people who are most severely impacted in this fight for the survival of our planet is the priority for me.
All right, I have another question, and this has come up for social media recently. The Minneapolis City Council is one of the highest paid, it's the highest paid city council in the state. You are having some of the responsibilities taken away from you. Should the Minneapolis City Council still be paid, members be paid $106,000 a year? St. Paul, they're paid about $68,000. Any thoughts?
I think you could talk to a park board candidate and that they were actually disagree of like, yes, we should have a fully paid staff to make sure that we're meeting the expansive needs of our constituents. Park board is paid, what, $13,000? And I know this is someone who supported a former park commissioner. I mean, even we have one here with Latricia Vitaw, and talking about how many of our folks are working 2 or 3 jobs. The same, I think we do a lot of work at the state capitol.
Park board
we shouldn't
only
have
13,000?
12,000.
12,000.
Yeah, and that means people have to have 2, 3 jobs.
Well, then you're a good point.
Yeah,
I
or be wealthy
think
or
these salaries
retired.
allow everyday people to run for this office and be able
Exactly.
to dedicate the kind of focus and energy that you need to serve the people of Minneapolis.
Absolutely.
I definitely thought that as a Parks Commissioner, I mean, I went into it knowing that
You got
it
paid
would be-
$12,000
that I got
a
paid
year.
$12,000. I had a full-time job that I get paid well at.
I bet you did.
But
To survive.
it was a lot more work than I thought it could ever be. I did not understand that the park board was as political and as demanding, especially as a citywide commissioner. So I had conversations early on about how we pay a better rate to park commissioners to recruit people who look like me to run, right? Like I was in a different situation where I could run. It was in my mind a part-time thing, but it really wasn't a part-time thing when I look at all the time I spent on constituent services, not even like the meetings that go on for 5 to 7 hours. It's just like, as a citywide commissioner, everyone wants you to know what's going on. And so where I know I'm representing Ward 4, it is about our city though. Like Ward 4 is my ward, it's my focus, but our city is what we're working towards. So I wouldn't suggest taking money away if you want, especially now we have the most diverse city council in the history of our city council. That I'm sure that has to speak to the pay. Folks are more excited to run because you are getting a wage. As a parks commissioner, I wasn't making $15 an hour. Robin talked about how she advocated for that, right? Like that wasn't my rate. I probably made 2 cents an hour as a park board commissioner. So I would, we haven't shifted these roles yet. There's a lot of talk about question 1 passing, but just from winning the election and these past 2 weeks, the amount of people who have reached out to me for meetings already, it's more than full time.
Everybody's nodding there quickly.
And Esme, I sense the energy that all these new council members have. And again, I'm sorry you're behind me, Robin. But it would be interesting to ask us this question in a year. In fact, I'm going to suggest you do this meeting, this film, a year
we'll
from
do
now,
it every year.
and see how we do. Because it's going to be
Some
nights.
of you go, no.
It's going to be weekends. It's going to be when we have to give up time from our personal lives.
Well, that's why so many incumbents lost. That's why you folks did so well.
Because we are promising constituent service.
Yeah, we didn't have a life.
Yeah, I think people.
It's very dramatic. I will say that as a parks commissioner, even my husband said sometimes like, what? I didn't know it was like you would spend this much time. And it's not just like work. Sometimes it's fun stuff. You want to show up for the fun stuff too. You don't want to just be the person that's talking policy all the time, or how to get the grass shoveled. There's community picnics that you're expected to be at, and there's
fun family Sundays.
Yeah, fun family Sundays. So it's not just like all of it is work. It's the work we signed up to do that I'm sure we're all passionate about doing, but it takes a lot of time. I've spoke to previous council members and current council members who have told me expect 16-hour days in the beginning. Once you get sworn in, expect 16-hour days. I mean, it's normal for me because I've had a full-time job and been on the park board, but you need to be prepared. And like your compensation, I'm looking forward to the benefits, I'll tell you that.
Okay. Well, listen, I think, I'm sorry, we're out of time here, so we have to leave it at that. But I want to thank all of you for exchanging your opinions. This has been a great discussion, and I think the people who will get to see this will really learn something about all of you. And all of you should be congratulated, because beating an incumbent is tough, and also those open seat elections are tough too, because there are always a lot of people running. So thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
You were just watching our extended interview with the new members of the Minneapolis City Council.